I have Phil from Texas who has got a he's a little bit confused about the meaning of some trans terms. So he's wanting some definitions. He's not clear. He's kind of old school. And Phil, you have called the right place. Instead of pestering your trans friends to tell them what it is they mean,
I
let
mean,
us
fair
help you
point.
out, buddy. What's up? What do you want to talk about?
Well, first, I would never pester my trans friends. But hello,
That's
Amberly.
awesome.
Hello, Christy. I'm so happy to be on your show. I'm an old fucker here in Texas, so we have some terms that I feel like have kind of fallen away. I'm not sure I understand the difference between transgender, transsexual. We used to have a word transvestite that never shows up anymore. What's the difference between a transgender and a transsexual person? Could you tell me?
Yeah, I guess I'll go ahead and jump in and say that yeah, you're right. A lot of these words are somewhat dated, and I guess I'll use my own field as an example. As a therapist, we are trained to be really mindful of our language, and that's something that we didn't do a great job of as a field for a really long time. You would often hear folks in psychiatry and in psychology refer to the borderline people, or talk about our schizophrenics are in the back, or kind of labeling people by their diagnosis. And so as a industry, psychology has worked really hard to focus on people first and to kind of update our language in a lot of ways. The reason I'm telling you this is because it has come to a little bit of a head in a couple of different communities. For instance, like the autistic community, the prevailing sentiment among psychology would be to say people with autism as opposed to saying autistic. However, folks within that community, generally speaking, very broadly, kind of hate the term person with autism. They feel like it misunderstands their experience, and so the term autistic is actually much more common in that community. What I mean to say here is that whenever we're talking to somebody about their sexuality, about their identity, I think it's useful to use the word that they use. And so that's what I really want to highlight here. Regardless of the like textbook definitional term of transgender versus transvestite, and some of these things, is to just listen to the terms that people use on themselves and to be respectful in following their lead. That being said, we don't generally use the term transsexual or transvestite anymore, but I would definitely want to be mindful or respectful. If somebody has been referring to themselves as a transvestite for the last 60, 70 years, I'm not going to come in and tell them that that's no longer correct, that they're not being PC and talking about their own identity. But to try and define those terms a little bit, because they can get a little bit varied, or people might have different understandings of them, I'll go ahead and say that transgender, not transgendered, by the way, you want to use that in the present tense without the ed. You're talking about somebody who has a gender identity that is different than the one that they were assigned at birth. If somebody was told when they were a child that they are a boy, but in reality they find themselves to be a woman, you would refer to that person as being transgender. Transvestite, generally speaking, refers to the clothes that somebody wears. You can be a cis male, but if you wear quote unquote women's clothing, you might use the term transvestite to refer to yourself.
Okay, got that part. But the term transsexual, does that mean anything anymore, or I don't understand. That's the term that I was really calling about, transsexual versus transgender. That's the part I don't understand.
Yeah, it's a similar notion to transgender. It highlights or emphasizes biology in some ways that we, generally speaking, now see as kind of problematic. Basically, the idea of being transsexual would be to say that your body went from being a boy body to a girl body, or a girl body to a boy body. And we just don't really conceptualize of our bodies in that way anymore. It is true to say that you can be a woman with a penis or with a vulva, and that's a notion that we didn't necessarily have 50 years ago. So again, I am respectful of the way that people refer to themselves, but transsexual and transgender, I'm not going to say they mean the exact same thing, because they are highlighting our like physical bodies versus our gender identities. But in effect, we're generally speaking about the same thing. Now, I say all of that. I definitely invite any trans folks or anybody in the queer community who maybe has a different understanding or a different experience to call in to disagree in the chat or wherever else, because these words are meant to serve people, not the other way around. And these words are all made up, and we're just here trying to find different weird sounds to make with our vocal cords to communicate and express ideas back and forth.
I have one further question. We used to talk about pre-op and post-op, and I haven't heard that much anymore. Is that now a meaningless distinction? Because I think maybe it is.
Yeah, well, I'll jump in again. I wouldn't say it's meaningless, but I would say that there's very good reason why we don't tend to use those terms. It again is kind of that distinction between transgender and transsexual. When we're talking about somebody being pre-op or post-op, we're ignoring that notion that you can be a woman with a penis, that you can be a man with a vulva. I know that notion is very simple, but also hard to wrap your mind around for a lot of folks that have been told otherwise over and over and over and over for 50, 60, 70 years of life. But the reality is, I think we as a culture need to get more comfortable with recognizing that your gender identity can exist in any kind of body. And when we talk about somebody being pre-op or post-op, what we're basically saying is that, yeah, you're trans and your body is like wrong, that you were born in the wrong body. And that's just not the case. It is disrespectful of people's identities. It is really presumptive and really invasive around people's bodies. Now, again, if somebody who is trans is talking about their own body and they're using that terminology, I want to be mindful to respect that, while also acknowledging that as a society, as a largely cis-dominated society, that we can really delete those kinds of notions from our vocabulary. Would y'all have anything to add to this, or anything you might disagree on?
No, I think you said it really well. For those who don't know, my wife is trans, and we don't. I was trying to think, like, if anyone was watching my face and they're like, what are they thinking? I was trying to think of a time that we used the term transgendered, and we really don't use like past tense transgendered. And honestly, we don't even really use the word besides trans, and we don't even use that because the idea is my wife is a woman, so it's very rare that we even talk about her being trans unless it's just like, oh, she's trans. So if you see like a picture of her from before and you're kind of confused, or like when we explain that our children are both biologically both of ours, I'm like, oh yeah, my wife is trans. Like that makes me go, oh, got you. Okay, this makes not that should matter, but still, like, yeah.
As a cis male, only when people are asking after that idea. Generally I just say I'm a man, and I don't need to get into more detail than that. And I don't think that trans folks should be expected to give that detail either. I mean, it can be kind of invasive. It's not shameful, but it is personal. It's not anybody else's business. And especially in a world that punishes trans identities, I have to be compassionate towards why people would want to keep that under wraps. Should
Yeah,
they choose that?
and like the word transvestite has become, depending upon how it's used, most times now it's more of a slur. But
Sure.
like its definition evolving since I was little isn't going to keep me from singing "I'm just a sweet transvestite. Like I
From
still love
transsexual.
sexual.
Transylvania. Yeah, I don't. Now YouTube's gonna have to, as if YouTube was gonna let this video stand anyway. But
Yeah, you're shadow banned, Christy.
We're
You're
shadow
absolutely
banned now.
shadow
We're
banned.
gonna get
we're
to
all
that.
shadow banned.
When I was a kid, I used to put on my aunt's bras. It was very fun. It was not
Yeah.
transvestite. Well, thank you for bringing me up to speed on the terminology. So much has changed so quickly. I'm just struggling to get the definitional stuff right.
And that's okay,
Really?
man. Like, you know,
Yeah.
some terms become obsolete. Some terms, as Amber Lee was saying, become inexorably linked to being a slur. Like the word queer. When I was a kid in the 80s, that was a bad word. And now it's sort of changed and we've sort of come full circle. Transvestite was kind of a slur for a man who wanted to put on women's clothes, and it was sort of frowned upon at that time. And now we've kind of moved away from transsexual towards transgendered because there's more, you know, the social zeitgeist is sort of moving towards a better understanding that sex and gender are two completely different things. So that word just doesn't, it's just obsolete. It's not that it's like it may be wrong, but it's just it doesn't really work anymore because, as Christy said, language serves us. It's not the other way around. So when a word fails to perform the function we need it to, well, we come up with a new one and a better one, and one that more accurately describes how people feel and their experiences. So, you know, it's okay not to be totally up on it. I think, as with a lot of this stuff, intent is everything. And you sound like you've got a great intent. So, you know, I would commend you for asking the question in the first place, Phil.
Just need some clarification. I'll be calling you back one of these days because I was in the adult community. I was a producer of softcore erotic films back in the 90s, and I have some great stories on that.
Ooh.
Might be calling you back.
Yeah, well, love to
Ooh.
hear it. Feel free to shoot us an email and let us know your story. I'm pretty curious.
I kind of want to hear that too.
I will. I'm sorry?
Phil, you can email us at sex@atheistcommunity.org. And to the rest of our viewers as well, if you have a question, if you're a little shy and you don't want to come on the air, you can always email us at atheist-community.org for those of us on the podcast listening. And we will stick it in our mailbag and we will get around to it.
Thank you guys so much for the clarification. It's been very helpful. I appreciate it.
Thank you. You have a great night.
Thank you.
Phil,
Bye-bye.
Thank you for calling, Phil.
Yeah, well, I always am kind of anxious in answering those kinds of questions with any sort of authority, not being from part of that community for myself. But I think it's important that we cis folks be having, or, you know, cis-ish, that we be furthering this dialogue and having this conversation and taking some of the burden off of trans folks who are frankly pretty fucking exhausted about having these conversations.
Well, that's what I was trying to get at at the beginning of the conversation. I wasn't trying to suggest that Phil would be asking awkward questions to people that don't want to answer them. But
yeah,
you know, like it's good that he can actually, you know, have this conversation and we can talk about it. And if we're wrong, then we can be corrected. We're allowed to change our minds and we're allowed to evolve as people. And so is our language.
There's an awesome book, my rabbi, for those who don't know, like we don't believe in Sky Daddy, but we still do the traditional Jewish stuff. Ironically, I'm really proud to actually say this. It made me so happy. Our synagogue, actually, people with young children are almost all LGBTQ now. Awesome. But like they made the whole staff, our rabbi's an older woman, she made the entire staff read this book called The Words We Use, and it's saying like how you can actually listen to how people talk about themselves in order to then talk back to them so that you're using the words that they use about themselves. And yeah, they retrained the entire staff over this book, and it made me be like, I don't believe in a Sky Daddy, but I believe in you, Rabbi. Thank you. Yeah, and I highly recommend it. It's an amazing book. The words that we
Yeah.
use.
Great. Well, I'll have that in the show notes for this episode.